Welcome to this episode with our special guest, Richard Smoley. Richard is a Harvard and Oxford educated writer, a prolific author of works on spirituality. I was first introduced to his work many years ago with his book, Inner Christianity, which gave a picture of an esoteric form of Christianity. Mr. Smoley has a new book out called A Theology of Love, Reimagining Christianity Through A Course in Miracles, a spirituality based on love, not fear. Richard, if you would like to, could you please tell us a little bit more about yourself and also about A Theology of Love?
Yes. Well, I've always been interested in spirituality, going back to certainly my college and pre-college days, if not earlier. I worked in various areas professionally as an editor and writer. In 1990, I started work I'm talking mostly about my professional life, which I think is more relevant to what we're talking about. I started as editor of Gnosis, a journal of the Western Inner Traditions, and I was there for 9 years. It closed for financial reasons in 99, like many smaller publications. Since 2005, I worked for the Theosophical Society in America, and since 2008, I've been editor of their publication, which is called Quest, Journal of the Theosophical Society in America. And you can find their website easily enough. I've written a number of books, but I've published 10, counting this one on spirituality. And this one is called A Theology of Love, Reimagining Christianity Through A Course in Miracles. And it's being published by Inner Traditions. It will be out in November. And basically, the idea in this book is that theology as it exists today. I'm talking about Christian theology. This is all I'm talking about. Jewish, Muslim, other traditions. I'm not going there. Those traditions have their own issues, problems, insights, and I'm not going there. This is about Christian theology, and that's quite enough of a subject for one book, because Christian theology is a mess. Why is it a mess? Let me explain this to you, because let me tell you the story of Christianity, the Christian idea in the somewhat frank, plain level terms. God got mad at the human race 6,000 years ago in Armenia because somebody ate a piece of fruit that they weren't supposed to. Well, he got so mad at them that he not only threw them out of this garden paradise, but doomed all of them and all of their children for eternity to roast in hell. Well, God felt sort of bad about this and got to thinking it over and said, well, maybe I should do something. So what he did was he sent a part of himself down to earth, had it incarnated in human form, and had it tortured to death. And this somehow made it all right with himself. Unfortunately for you and me, this lift of eternal damnation is only provisionally made in that we have to believe this whole story, otherwise we're still damned to eternal perdition. This is nonsense. And how can I prove that it's nonsense? This doctrine of eternal perdition, it was invented partly to get people to believe this idea that I just presented to you, because it's such a crazy idea that only threats of duress would get anyone to believe it. And the church was really quite insistent that people believe it and accept it for 2,000 years. And why can I talk freely about it now? Because the church and the churches and their theology have lost a certain amount of power. So whether anybody listens to me or not, or pays attention to my ideas, at least I'm not going to be roasted at the stake or have my tongue cut out and my hands cut off, which happened in the days when previous days when people questioned this. So that's a start anyway.
Yes, thank you. I certainly also have a problem with, in the way that you describe modern Christianity, it sounds to me as if God were a sort of Kim Jong-il figure.
Oh yeah, but also, yeah, you're right. But then it's a little worse than that, because this Kim Jong-il figure is also somehow infinitely loving beyond all consideration and all human capacity for love. So in addition to all of this, he's this embodiment of love beyond our imagining. Go figure that one out.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can.
Well, I can't either. I'm not going to figure it out, because I've just been trying to say it doesn't make any sense. I mean, may as well be honest enough to admit that.
Right.
If people find comfort in it, if they find somehow it makes sense to them, that's fine with me. I'm not interested in making converts, but I am also well aware that there are many, many people for whom this does not make sense, and they have nowhere else to look, and they can't make anything coherent out of Christianity at all. And that is what this book is for.
I see. Ray, do you have any comments?
Well, I have to admit that within a few minutes of beginning the book, I found myself laughing a lot. And I suppose when it's articulated in the way that you just articulated it, it has that quality of being evidently preposterous. But what I found really interesting in the introduction was, I can't find it exactly, but it was something like the recurring question is, what do we believe now that we don't believe?
Yes, that's right. And that is the problem of much, certainly liberal and mainstream Protestantism today, particularly Protestantism. I have friends who are clergymen in these denominations, and it's quite clear that if you poke them a little, they're not too sure what they believe. They're prominent, respected clergymen in their denominations. I'm not giving names, I'm not giving denominations, but they're not really too sure. And they're kind of clueless. And, well, the problem is, if I'm clueless, if you're clueless, all right, we're clueless about this. What do we mean? But it's your job, if you're in a profession like that, to reinforce other people's faith and to help them to come to terms with it. And on the one hand, you're pretending to do this because that's what your job is. On the other hand, you're not even sure how to do it for yourself.
Well, that's something I've noticed. I've spent some time down in the South, and I've also lived in New York, and I go into an Episcopalian bookshop, and you can find Gnostic texts in there. You can find almost anything in there. And that, on the one hand, I thought, wow, they're incredibly open-minded. But I was also wondering, like, what do these people actually believe? Because I feel like I'm in like a New Age bookstore or something. On the other hand,
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, on the other hand, when I was in Georgia, there was some very serious-minded letter of the law Christianity going on, and even among those who seemed like they were letter of the law, there were other people who said they weren't serious enough, and they were taking over campuses. And one of the things that you talked about is that even in that context, a lot of these people kind of just get corralled into being preoccupied with some basic political issues that kind of makes them like more of a political voting bloc or a political force.
Well, I agree with what you've said, and what you've said raises an enormous number of issues. Let me just take one strand, which is the last one, which is if you don't really have much of a theology, you're kind of forced back on social issues because it's something at least you can understand. Somebody's against abortion. Someone's for abortion. Well, we can understand that. The theology has long been pushed aside. The evangelicals, the fundamentalists, well, we believe this, or we're supposed to believe this, or in many cases we pretend to believe this. The Episcopalians, as you mentioned, it's like, well, we kind of believe the 39 articles or whatever, but on the other hand, just talking between adults, we're not so sure. Catholics, in a way, they have it better because Catholicism is highly sacramental. So it's not, particularly these days, the Catholic Church's dogmas are, it's a lot less rigid about them than it used to be. And their priests are often probably just as skeptical as anyone. But it's all about the Mass, the Eucharist, and so on. You can go and perform and participate in the Mass. And the theology, you don't have to think too much about the theology. You like the Mass, and it's a satisfying ritual for many. So in a way, they're not faced with this particular issue the way the Protestants are. So that's one strand. The liberal Protestants, starting with particularly with the Lutherans in Germany, the Evangelische Kirche, as they call themselves, really started to study in a scholarly way what was going on back there. And all of this stuff about these Gnostic texts, all of these stuff about the historical Jesus. As Albert Schweitzer said, who wrote a famous book on the subject, said all of this inquiry was an act of an incredible moral and intellectual courage, and that was true. Unfortunately, the conclusions are somewhat equivocal, and we're back to what do we believe now that we no longer believe.
I read recently that probably the most important, historically speaking, church in Norway, the priest in charge of it is an atheist.
Well, that's kind of, and again, I mean, I don't know. You can either laugh at it, and it is pretty funny, or you can say, well, at least the guy is intellectually honest, which a lot of clergymen aren't. I have a friend who's a Methodist minister in Dallas, and I had him over for dinner once when he was up in our area, and I said, you learn all this stuff about how the Bible is not literature. You learned it in the seminary. Well, did you ever, tell your congregation, your flock about it? He said, no. And I said, well, why not? He said, well, I chickened out. And he was a remarkably intelligent and honest man for saying that. But I think that's a lot of what's going on. And as I say in the introduction of my book, that's kind of where Christianity is. Oh, by the way, theology was once called the queen of the sciences. It's not considered a science now. And there are movements in various universities for throwing it out of academia altogether. I'm not in favor of that particularly, but it does speak to the kind of crisis that theology has, both in terms of external perception and, I believe, internally as a discipline.
Theologically speaking, it seems that you are sort of rallying against this Christianity that has become something of a dead institution. And I kind of read your book as if you're trying to revive it into something better.
Well, a lot of Theology of Love, which is my new book, deals with a text called A Course in Miracles, which is an extremely peculiar text. I believe it's the greatest spiritual text of the 20th century. And its beginnings are extremely odd, as everyone will concede. This woman was in the psychology department at Columbia University, so she's not exactly, ignorant, started hearing these voices in her head, or this voice in her head. This was started in 1965. And it said, this is a course in miracles. Please take notes. Well, she thought she was going crazy. She was in the psychology department, so she confided this to a colleague, and I said, no, you're really not displaying any clinical symptoms of insanity. And she said, well, what should I do? So why don't you just write down what it tells you to write? I'll help you. She took notes in shorthand, and her friend helped her transcribe it. And years later, it ended up as a 1,200-page book called A Course in Miracles. Now, that is only one of the peculiar things about it. The other is that the voice claimed to be that of Jesus Christ himself. Now, there are a lot of things allegedly channeled by Jesus Christ, and I am agnostic about what connection any of these have to the actual personage historically known as Jesus. there's no way of proving it. Because, as you know, you can't compare it to the Gospels, because most respected scholars can't even agree on what in the Gospels actually authentically goes back to Jesus. And the teachings of the churches many of them were developed centuries later for extremely peculiar reasons that are much easier to understand historically than theologically. But all that said, it is a profound spiritual text. It would be a profound spiritual text whether it had been dictated by Jesus Christ himself or knocked off by a room full of chimps on keyboards. And what is the one thing and one thread of its teaching that I'm going into here in this book is the fact that this is the only theologically and logically meaningful interpretation of the Christian message that I've ever come across. And I think for that reason alone, it needs to be considered more seriously than it has been. Now, this is all rather topical because the most prominent spokesperson for A Course in Miracles was just in presidential debates, a woman named Marianne Williamson. I don't know her personally, and actually I haven't read any of her books. I met her in passing once. But I think, although she's probably fairly realistic about chances of the Democratic nomination, I think she probably took this platform, and she was in the debates on Thursday, simply as a way of presenting at least presenting these values in some kind of public format. In any case, the course, as it's called by its students, is a very profound teaching, and its theology resembles Christian theology, but shall we say, in my opinion, at any rate, corrects it. And it is simple and logical and consistent. Oh, by the way, all this stuff about everybody being damned to hell because God got mad at the human race. Well, A Course in Miracles teaches predestination. You are destined to illimitable happiness, joy, peace, forever. This is the will of God, and it cannot be reversed. So why is everything such a bloody mess? Because, for various reasons that we can go into either here or you can read my book, the human race, shall we say, collectively and individually decided to try to live without God. What would it be like without God? In fact, the book of Genesis speaks to this truth, and the book of Genesis is, in its own strange way, true, although not literally true. Because, to reinterpret it, tell the story in a funny way, this man and woman went up to God once, and they said, hey, God, we heard there's this thing called good and evil, and we'd really like to see what it's like. And God said, that is not a good idea. I do not suggest you do this. And they said, oh, come on, you wanna. And God said, all right, but you're going to have to go to a realm where you have to work hard for a living. That's going to hurt to have babies, among other things. And human beings got coats of flesh. What are the coats of flesh you're wearing on? You're wearing on even if you're listening to this stark naked. Coats of flesh, get it? So we chose to experience good and evil in this world. And we can stay in it as long as we want. That is free will. But as the Course in Miracles also says, capacity for suffering has a limit. Eventually, you're going to decide there has to be a better way. And that, I think, what A Course in Miracles is what the Course in Miracles is trying to do. What is its main message? What is its main message? Well, to put it in one single word, forgiveness. You are not going to get out of this mess. I am not going to get out of this mess. Nobody's going to get out of this mess without practicing forgiveness at an extraordinarily deep level. Since this is something that kind of Jesus seems to say in the Gospels, it's not entirely alien even to conventional Christianity. But in terms of the world as we've known it, well, we might as well try this because we tried everything else and it's failed.
So I have one question about that, which is one of the contexts that Christian believers give for being willing to forgive, or one of the kind of consolations that they receive, is that there will in fact be justice. How would justice play out if eventually, even someone who has sinned greatly against them will also experience that divine liberation?
Well, A Course in Miracles presents a very difficult idea, which is that in order to experience good and evil, the Son of God, which is all of us, it says about Jesus, is he the Christ? Oh, yes, along with you. The Son, called in his fallen state in esoteric Christianity, called Adam, fell, and this was a fall into this world. Now, this was not like dropping down from heaven, like in some David Bowie movie. This is a cognitive fall. It was a shock, a trauma, far greater than any psychiatry is capable of envisioning. And out of this loss of awareness, this world arose. So, the only way out of this is to say, this is not really what's going on. So we use an example from contemporary culture. The Matrix. Everyone has seen the Matrix. A lot of people have. And everybody's immersed in this factitious world made up by these entities who are keeping human beings asleep. And this world looks very much like the, more or less sustainable misery of late 19th century urban America. But it's completely illusory. So, let's say you're in this matrix, which we may well be as human beings on this plane. Somebody does something wrong in this kind of totally factitious reality. What is justice in that case? The only real justice is to wake up and to get involved in like who did what to who in this illusion is at the very least not going to get you any further out. So that is kind of it. So the fact to say that is the world illusory, our cognition of it is illusory, and it's defective. And how many people have said this? What is the main teaching of Buddhism? That the main cause of suffering is ignorance or obliviousness. A Course in Miracles is simply the same thing in the language of Christianity. You can call it Maya, Ma Rigpa in Tibetan, I think is one way of expressing it. There are a lot of different terms for it because a lot of people figured this out and very independent. So that would be what? Justice. Now, and the more you insist on the kind of retributive justice, that I think you were talking about, well, the more you're just going to get mired in this. Let me take a very practical example, which is the U.S. prison system. The U.S. prison system is based on some sort of retributive justice. Well, what does it do? Does it reform people? No. Does it punish them? Yeah, I guess it does punish them. Does it create any restitution to the actual victim? Not in and of itself. All it really does is keep offenders off the streets for a while, and even the value of that, I'm speaking from a purely sociological point of view, is debated. So all of this retribution, all of this justice has to be administered by on our own terms hasn't really worked too well. So that would be a long answer to that. Of course, that is the technical term for that is, of course, theodicy, justice of God, and that is one aspect of the answer. I'll go on. I'll say, well, you may think that what about all these monsters in history? Well, pick your favorite monster in history. I'm not even going to mention their names because I don't want to bring their names into this. What is it? Can we forgive X monster in history? Well, I don't know. Most of them are all gone. So your forgiveness or lack of forgiveness has nothing to do with anything. Most people hold their indignation against crimes of the past as a kind of belief that, well, if I'm a good person, I must feel this. Some of it is genuine compassion, but in practical terms, you're forgiving or you're not forgiving all of these great inflictors of horror are really quite immaterial. You're just making yourself miserable.
Interesting. I'm thinking about, and when following a sort of a Eastern path, what do you find in meditation? And of course, the Buddha also found this with things like the Maras that were attacking him when he was on the verge of enlightenment. Is that the sort of deeper that you go, the more subtler the games get. Mm-hmm. And to think of that in terms of forgiveness, I kind of have personal memories of, when I've forgiven someone, but that maybe somewhere in the back of my mind, there might be like fantasies of violence towards them or that sort of thing. Like I haven't actually forgiven them.
Yeah.
And it seems like the closer you get to true forgiveness, the more subtler those types of games can get. So maybe it's just a rhetorical question, but I wonder where it actually is within a person that brings forth true forgiveness.
Well, as the Buddha might have said, in a different context, in a different way, it comes from inside. And let's go from the very abstract theological issue of forgiveness to the very practical one, which is your grievances are making you miserable. They are making you miserable. And if you have insight into that fact, so are mine. I'm no exception to any of the things I'm talking about. They're making you miserable. It's I think it was a Buddhist who said it's like trying to hurt someone else by drinking poison. So if you realize, hey, this isn't doing me any good, you have much more interest in, because as you say, the games of cosmic justice as conceived of by the ego, the fallen human cognition, always gets very complicated. I'll forgive them. If I forgave them, you start playing all sorts of little games with it. But if you realize these things are simply not doing you any good, and they're not doing you any good, I mean, even on a perfectly, even on this level, because you're just going around upsetting yourself, you may need a woman who's, beaten every night by her drunken husband, may well need to leave it. But it might be best to say, okay, it's over. I'm out of there. It's his life is his life, rather than stewing about it for the next 20 years. Okay, no more of this, but I'm leaving Pops behind, but I'm also leaving all my grievances against Pops behind, and I'm going to start a new life. So what I'm trying to say is that there's real value in forgiveness, even from a fairly conventional level. And you'll hang on to grievances as long as you think at some level they're doing you some good. The minute you decide they're not doing you any good, they're not. It's like your garbage. I mean, it's like, the hoarder thing. People hoard all, newspapers, trash, blah, blah, blah. And why do they keep all of this stuff? Because at some level, they think they're going to get some good out of it. But if they came to their senses and looked around and said, this is all just garbage. I just got to get this out of here. They would haul it out, or someone else would haul it out, and they'd have a nice clean house, and they'd probably feel a lot better. So this is talking about taking out one's internal garbage and realizing that it is garbage.
Well, the hoarder analogy really strikes a note with me, because there was a point where I used to do estimates for recyclable materials, but also for cleanouts in general, and I encountered the homes of many hoarders, and it was insane. I mean, one person with whom I was working was really became infuriated. The garbage was so high, we were actually like crawling on our bellies over this garbage that was like a foot from the ceiling.
And yet, at some level, conscious or not, this guy was keeping it because he thought somehow it was doing him some good. I mean, obviously, there are all sorts of psychological issues that, we can't even speculate about. But at some level, he seemed to think this was doing him some good, or would do him some good, or by George, he would need that, broken fly swatter at some point in the near future.
Right. Well, this particular person actually told us that he actually talked about the Bible. He said that people weren't really getting the message.
Wow, I don't know, I don't know which part of the Bible you could specifically invoke to justify quoting, but I'm sure the human mind is so infinitely creative that we could certainly do it.
Right. How you just described forgiveness, I kind of get a sense that, for example, when you're holding a grievance against someone else, and when you decide to forgive them, there's also an aspect of self-forgiveness in terms of surrendering that grievance.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Forgiveness is also to be extended to yourself. And it's no brilliant stroke of genius to say that that's often the most difficult part. And sometimes we don't want to let go of our grievances toward others because we're afraid of letting them go toward ourselves. See, the thing about it is the world, as we construe it, even sort of ethical world, believes that in many cases that holding grievances makes you a good person. I mentioned the previous monsters of history. If you hold grievances against would these be decent people? Would we be decent people? And if we didn't, could it happen again? Well, I suppose all those things could happen again. But the horrible truth about them is, if you were in those situations at those times, you have no idea how you'd behave. You might be a hero. You might not be. Chances are, statistically likely, you probably wouldn't. Very likely, I might not be either. But we like to imagine that we would be heroes in a given context, although sometimes it doesn't always happen. The most classic treatment of this in literature is Conrad's Lord Jim, which is precisely about a guy who thinks he wants to be a hero. And it's a great book, and I'm not going to go into its plot.
It seems, with how popular virtue signaling has gotten, that there's a sort of new profession of, professional grievance holders. It takes me back to your metaphor about the man in the box of mirrors. And the man is sort of so afraid of reality touching him that he prefers to stay in the box. But in this professional grievance holder space, there's a little hole in the box, and he can hurl objects at people through the hole.
Well, the box of mirrors, this is an analogy in my book. And the analogy is this. A man builds a box, and he lines it with mirrors. And he goes inside. And he stays there long enough to forget anything else. He goes sane. At first, he starts thinking, wow, that his fate, all he sees, everywhere he looks, is reflection upon reflection of himself. But he forgets that. He scowls, and he thinks that there's an enemy. He smiles, and he finds a friend. He cries, and he feels compassion for the suffering being he sees. And it's all his own deluded reflections. If he punches one of them, he's basically just punching a mirror. And eventually, and that is us. And what is this box of mirrors? A box has 6 sides. And you could say that its dimensions are the dimensions we normally take for reality. In the book, I mentioned C.G. Jung, who had a near-death experience late in life, and was looking down on himself. He didn't want to go back. But someone said, no, you have to go back. You have things to do that. And so I'm going to have to go down into the 3-dimensional box again. And that is kind of what we're living in, that we take for reality. So that is one aspect of that. There's more to it in the book, but that's a reasonably succinct version of it.
Well, in the context of the box and the ray of creation, one thing that I found interesting was how you looked at the process of the generation, the different levels of that ray. You just talked about the 6 sides of the box, and you end up with, you start with the cognizing self as one, and what you call the primordial ternary as three, and then the six directions. And you talk about the fourth term that Jung introduced, the second he in the Tetragrammaton, and then looked at the 12 distinguishable permutations of the name of God, which you also discussed relating to the 12 signs of the zodiac. And interestingly, you brought up Kant's 12 categories. And I noticed the pattern. You noted another pattern, and you compared yours, and you were saying, I'm not sure which is right, but this is what I'm coming up with. I noticed that the numbers for the levels map to Ouspensky's concept of the ray of creation. So the first level, number 1, second level, number 3, third level is number 6, next level is number 12. So it actually looks like the way that you're organizing it maps to Ouspensky's, the way that Ouspensky has described it.
Yes. Those are close analogies. Now, the model I'm describing in my book, and it's going to take more time to really go into it than I think we have, but comes from a Kabbalistic text called the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, or the Book of Formation, the oldest, very brief Kabbalistic text dating, they think, between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD. And it talks about 10 spheros, which means principles of nothingness. The boundless north, the boundless south, the boundless east, the boundless west, the boundless top, the boundless bottom, the boundless beginning, the boundless end, the boundless good, and the boundless evil. Now, as I explain in the book, this is reality. Because we have 3 dimensions of space, top down, four directions horizontally. We have the dimension of time, which is the beginning and the end, and we also have a moral direction of good and evil, which I would equate with movement. Why would I equate it with movement? You move toward that which you perceive as good. You move away from that which you perceive as evil. As, in fact, it says in part of the Course in Miracles material, you wouldn't even go to the next room if you didn't feel that you were going to benefit from it in some way. So we have a dimension of movement, which brings about time, and then these 3 dimensions of space. That's why I call it the 5-dimensional box in one of those chapters. And that is reality. And, well, by the way, you see the 6 directions everywhere. I once visited a famous medicine man, and I was going home, and he had one of his men bless me to the 6 directions, like horror of the 6 directions, with some tobacco. I was grateful for that because it saved me from a serious accident in my home. I'll just cut that story short. But why is it universal? Because this is our cognition. And this is the way we experience ourselves anyway, as front, back, left, right. I would say, yes, there's a correspondence to Ouspensky's system. I didn't evoke it, partly because Ouspensky's way of arriving at it is just a little different. I think with a lot of these systems, you do see correspondences that are really quite striking and they can't be totally coincidental. On the other hand, it's useful for the most part to see them as, shall we say, discrete systems. You can see the analogies. You can see the connections. You can see the differences. Because they're all perspectives on something with infinite perspectives. It's always, and I get see this all the time. I don't know how many manuscripts I've seen as an editor over the years. It's just a bit dangerous to try to map one system quite one-on-one with the other. There are intriguing parallels, and each one has its own insights and its rewards. The only danger really is saying, well, this is exactly like that. I think the systems, however, they all have their own validity, are never quite link up in a one-on-one way.
Well, that definitely makes a lot of sense. But in terms of the ray of creation, and when you're numbering the number of laws that you're under, there is a way that it's connected. And again, I don't mean to imply that there's some kind of facile one-to-one correspondence, but you talk about Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov tries to prove that he's above the law by murdering the old woman pawnbroker and her sister. He tries to free himself from the laws of the ordinary level, but by using laws of a still lower level, those of brute violence. So he fails. The end of Crime and Punishment shows him on his way to penal service in Siberia.
Right.
So that is, Dostoevsky, Uspensky talks about the different number of laws that operate on different levels, and trying to actually put yourself under fewer laws. And he uses the example of someone, if he commits a crime and he's in prison, he's under more laws. And if he commits a crime and he ends up in a military prison, he's under even more laws, in terms of trying to show the different levels of constraint. But I think in a basic sense, like, I think you have a section that's called the two laws, or the two levels.
The law on two levels.
Yeah, the law on two levels is that you can actually choose to transcend the law and come to a higher level, and therefore have more freedom. And so that would map to this, although the methods are different. You're essentially saying to choose, I think the term you use, you say you choose God's law. And in this sense, would you consider those two directions, whether I'm going upward, choosing God's law, or transgressing and finding myself kind of under more constraints, arguably under more laws, to be related to essentially be choosing the direction of good and evil, good or evil?
No, not exactly.
Okay, so how would you distinguish that?
Well, and the reason I say that is to go back to something I said earlier. Good and level is part of the, shall we say, coordinates of this level. You know how Nietzsche spoke of going beyond good and evil, and Uspensky is certainly familiar with Nietzsche. But what I'm saying is this. At this level, and I'm talking about ordinary life the way you know it, a world of paying your bills, a world of respecting the laws or not respecting the laws, the life of being moral and not fooling around with your best friend's wife, or fooling around with your best friend's wife as such. All of those has consequences, right? And if you live purely on that level, you can live as a good person or a bad person. And life generally is easy if you're a good person. But the second higher level that I'm talking about is one of what the Course talks about as just total love, total forgiveness. And if you behave that way, generally speaking, your life becomes a lot easier, even on this level. If only because, as I said earlier, you're not torturing yourself with your own grievances every waking second of the day. So that is kind of what it is. It's like, whether it really, as I say, I don't think it really relates to, I think it's an analogy, but I don't think it relates directly to Uspensky's idea of laws of the ray of creation. But in the sense, like, yeah, if you're kind, if you're forgiving, if you're loving, life will be easier. Generally speaking, people will like you more. You'll have less trouble in life. Does that say you'll have no trouble in life? I didn't say that. No one can promise that. But generally speaking, actually, life does become easier on this level.
So then, could you maybe correlate that more to grace?
Well, grace, in the sense that Christianity uses it, is not quite. It's not that present in the Course's teachings, in that everybody receives endless grace all the time from God, and the only thing that keeps us from it is our own, shall we say, refusal of it. And refusal of it, it does include holding grievances, getting upset, behaving in petty ways. So the grace is always there. You certainly don't need any vehicles of grace. You don't need any rituals to hook you up with grace. It's always there. As of course, it's really not teaching you love. It's showing you how to remove the obstacles to love's presence, or to your awareness of love's presence.
So maybe more reception of grace.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about it is, if you think you've done something bad, you're going to kind of run away. You're going to run away from, and someone's going to run away from good things. I mean, a little bit like Cain as portrayed in Genesis. He's horribly guilty, and he thinks God is going to punish him, so he wanders off someplace off far by himself.
I have a little something to add. This is perhaps another striking correspondence. When I was looking at the table you created of the sacred ternary in various traditions, the Trinity is something that has obsessed me since my teens, and I found it's used both in Eastern and Western traditions, and I had a lot of sort of intuitive understandings about it. And then when I was introduced to Gurdjieff, I sort of found out that I was on the right track, in that the Trinity is not exactly a group of three things, but a unity composed of a duality that is conciled by a third, which is a force. And your chart seems to have concisely worked within a structure similar to that.
Yes.
And map this idea across a number of spiritual schools. And then you connect that with these systems of 12. And in the sort of study that I've done on things like archaeoastronomy and the work of geometers with number, and particularly with musicology, what might be called an esoteric form of musicology, well, I immediately noticed this connection because there are 12 notes in the octave, and there are all kinds of different systems of tuning that we have to give space to all of them, because there's never a perfect one. But anyway, one of the main correspondences that I see that I thought you might find interesting, when you describe that in these systems of 12, one of the 12 is a betrayer, like Judas and the 12 apostles. In music, we have what is called the wolf interval, or the Pythagorean comma, etc., where in most tuning systems that have some perfect intervals, one of the 12 intervals between notes in the octave cannot be tamed to be like the others. So this idea of 1 and 12 being a betrayer seems to appear perfectly in music.
That is really, the musicology that you bring up is extremely fascinating. And in all honesty, I'd never heard of the wolf interval, but it does seem like a very, very exact analogy. And sometime in the very near future, I'm going to go on the internet and look up the wolf interval, because it is a fascinating concept. I put it this way, and I'm putting it, let me put it metaphorically, or symbolically, in that, let us say the spirit is coming into incarnation through the solar system. And it comes through, there are always 12 signs of the zodiac. Whenever you're born, you're going to be born under one sign of the zodiac, which is your sun sign, as everybody knows. Well, why would this be your betrayer? Well, most astrologers, I think, would say that your sun sign represents your essential nature. But even that is somewhat skewed. That is to say, as I say in the book, if you're a Scorpio, you may be a little bit too likely to look into, depths and motivations that may not be there. If you're a Gemini, you may be more likely to take everything on the surface, that sort of thing. These are all betrayals in a sense. And that's why there are always 12 apostles, because there always has to be 12 of each type, of each representation, so there can be some balanced whole, which no one individual can provide. So that's part of it. But the wolf interval is really an extraordinarily interesting idea. I will look it up.
I like your idea with the zodiac. It seems to fit well with Jung in that sort of the way that we're born, or certain tendencies we have. He sees as basically that we need to balance them with some counter tendency.
Yeah, and there are basically two things going on, this is not really very much in the book, but we're talking about essence. But Gurdjieff and Spencer talk about essence. Obviously, there's also personality and conditioned self, and there are huge numbers of distortions there that need to be balanced, possibly in a quite different way, or possibly at a different stage.
Well, yeah, there is a whole school of thought that talks about if you're born under a certain sun sign, you are deficient in some sort of a mineral salt or something, that there's something that you're missing because of that particular being born at that particular time. And part of what they're attributing that to is that you were not in the womb 12 months, so that there were 3 months that are missing in some sense.
Oh, well, that's I never heard about that physiologically, but it corresponds fairly closely to what I was talking about with the signs of the zodiac. Yeah.
You have an interesting reference to Reimagined. You quote here. You say, like the man in the box of mirrors, Reimagined has imprisoned himself, but in a human body, and here are the consequences. All the myriads of eternity, all the wisdoms and joy of life roll like a sea around him, except what his little orbs of sight by degrees unfold, and now his eternal life, like a dream, was obliterated.
Right. Yes, exactly. And elsewhere, I use the analogy of a man who has a house with an enormous, beautiful mountaintop view, but he refuses to believe that anything that is not, that he can't see out of that window can exist. And science is somewhat like that. If we can't quantify it and verify it, then it either does not exist or it might as well not exist. And we are paying a heavy price for that worldview. And I think the environmental crisis, all of this is the direct consequence of the scientific worldview. And I'm not optimistic about the possibility of humanity fixing it through the very worldview that caused it. But that's another enormous topic.
It sounds Heideggerian.
Well, conceivably. Heidegger's a big subject, and maybe we shouldn't go there, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I hesitated to bring that up, but the point that you make is interesting. You piqued my interest, and I read through some more William Blake, and what I found was that the Reimagined is a character in a poem entitled Vala, which essentially places Reimagined as a distinct being, but as actually a fragment of a more complete being. And you mentioned the connection in the book. You mentioned
right,
the connection to reason and also to horizon. So it appears that he maps to reason, but that these other characters in Vala are connected with other aspects of a fragmented self. So the poem Vala actually opens up with the statement, "4 mighty ones are in every man, a perfect unity, cannot exist, but from the universal brotherhood of Eden. And so it's interesting in that there's this image of this being who's delimited through a taking form, but also alienated from Urthona, who's connected with imagination, Luva, connected with the heart, and Tharmas with the unity of the body, the instinct, and the personality.
Yeah, well, I'm not familiar enough with Blake's system to go into that, and it might well be that he was pointing towards something maybe even quite different from what I'm talking about. But, to go back to Horizon, another version of the myth is that, the cosmic man who's hermaphroditic, Adam Kadmon, as Kabbalists say, in falling into this realm of good and evil, shattered into any number of pieces, and each of which is one of us. So by our very perceiving ourselves as individuals, we're cutting ourselves off from the greater unity of the whole. As I say, it's called in the Christian tradition, man in its fallen state is called Adam, and Christ in its restored state. As in Adam, all men die, so in Christ all are made alive.
I think what you're describing is exactly what happens in Vala. Its Albion is called the cosmic man.
Well, that sounds quite plausible. As I told you before we were on the air, I haven't read Vala, so I can't really comment on that point, but it sounds quite similar in many respects.
I guess one of the only reasons I bring it up is I found it interesting in terms of what you mentioned about Philip K. Dick, because Valis is similar to Vala, and Valis in this system is actually connected to it's the missing emanation from the heart and connected with nature. And you mentioned Valis, Philip K. Dick, which is an acronym for Vast Active Living Intelligence System, which is invading this defective universe in order to liberate us.
I mean, Dick himself struggled with his own insights, and he has an enormous amount of profound things to say. I'm not sure I understand his thought in toto. Maybe he himself didn't. But in analogy from what I'm talking about to what I'm talking about, this world, this cosmos is defective as a result of our defective cognition of it. We don't really see what's out there. And something has to come in from outside, which in Dick's novels is ballast, to awaken us. And in the system of A Course in Miracles, what comes in to awaken us is called the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, in a sense, is the aspect of the divine that both recognizes and is able to deal with our fallen state and remembers our ultimate connection with God. So in that sense, as I said in the book, there's a lot of striking analogies between A Course in Miracles and Dick's thought. I don't know that he ever read it. He could have, because it was published in 1975, and he didn't die till 1982. Whether he did or not, I don't know. But it's not impossible that, for various reasons, it was decided by various authorities that we don't know anything about, wanted to put the same idea out there, both in the form of the fairly intellectual Course in Miracles and the science fiction of Dick. And of course, his influence has been enormous. I mean, there are just so many movies out there that talk about this kind of factitious reality, this kind of simulacrum. It's like, it's The Matrix is probably most successful, but The Dark City, The Truman Show, Existence, on and on. You've seen all these movies, and probably more than I have.
Yeah, those are some of our favorite movies.
Yeah. On that note, there's a really interesting TV movie called Virtual Nightmare, and it's the same sort of idea where, it's this defective virtual world, and the protagonist starts to figure that out. And what's interesting is that when he sort of wakes up from that nightmare, the people in charge of finding the people that wake up and putting them back asleep, they give him a pill to put him back into the virtual world. But the interesting aspect there is that the pill is a placebo.
That's really good. We'll have to watch that. What network is it on?
It aired in 2000. It's probably available for rent, but yeah, Virtual Nightmare from 2000.
I mean, one of the more recent programs along this line that I've enjoyed is the OA.
Yeah.
Which, without going into the whole plot, I mean, you can see a lot of the same themes here, and you could see this whole idea permeating mass culture. And I would like to think, and I do think in my more optimistic moments, it is a reflection that human beings collectively, if not awakening, trying to awaken. As I say, that's my more optimistic moments.
Right. I have some empathy with not really seeing good prospects for the sort of the current mindset to get us out of the quagmire, that we have to look to something greater or higher. And in another podcast, Ray and I both discussed that our psychedelic experiences had a lot to do with us becoming ecologically conscious. And it does seem like there needs to be some type of higher being or higher consciousness involved in letting us see the drastic errors of our ways.
To put it on a more mundane level, what the human race really just needs is a big mama to say, "This place is a mess, clean it up." And perhaps all of this this rather unfortunate climate change business is maybe her way of doing that.
I have a quick question. Taking it back to the genesis, so to speak, of A Course in Miracles, in A Theology of Love, you brought up one thing among many that I found interesting. I believe when you were discussing a person who had a vision of Jesus, there was a point that we can divide the phenomenology from the ontology. To the skeptic for whom spirit does not exist, it is actually quite provable to him, even scientifically, that disregarding whether spirit exists or not, spiritual experience does exist, and that experience is life-changing and life-fulfilling. And I think that with that divide of the phenomenology and the ontology, there may be a way to sort of introduce these ideas to people that would normally not be open to them because of their skepticism.
Well, you have to face a certain awkward fact here. That skepticism, as it is now, is basically a defense mechanism, because there is such a thing as general skeptical inquiry. But today, when a person calls himself or herself a skeptic, most likely he is a naive, or she is a naive believer in materialism.
Right.
And even a rather naive form of materialism, which very few philosophers of any stripe would be like adhere to, except unless you want to consider Ayn Rand a major philosopher, that the way we apprehend reality is exactly the way it is. Well, we know that's not true. I mean, we know that's true empirically, even from a scientific point of view, because bees can see colors we can't, dogs can hear sounds we can't. Our perceptual devices are actually really a fairly narrow filter. And then to turn around and say, yeah, but somehow the input of this really quite limited neural cognitive structure is really the whole picture, or gives us the whole picture, is logically inconsistent. And as I also said in the book, this is becoming a real problem intellectually with scientific materialism. And it means that a great number of the preconceptions and assumptions of the scientific worldview they're coming down. Because they're tumbling down now. Because you're starting to see even in mainstream scientific publications, this notion that consciousness is fundamental to the universe and so on. They just can't anymore adhere to this kind of eighth grade Mr. Science view of reality in which Newton's laws explain everything. It's okay, there's this stuff called quantum things, but nobody really understands that anyway.
Interesting. That brings up so many questions I don't think we'll have the time for today. But I do have one main question that's like a little bit longer, and sort of maybe we have to go through it step by step. But I'm also wondering, Ray, if you have something you want to discuss before that.
Well, there's actually a passage from the book of John that I think you might be able to, it might give an opportunity to explain the theology of love more. So I'd like to read the passage and then get your thoughts on it. Okay, so this is John 10:30 to John 10:37. I and the Father are one. Again, his Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus said to them, I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We are not stoning you for any good work, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. Jesus answered them, Is it not written in your law, I have said, you are gods? If he called them gods, to whom the word of God came, and Scripture cannot be set aside, what about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world? Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy, because I said, I am God's Son?
Well, there's certainly a lot in that passage. And as everyone I think knows, John is the most esoteric of the Gospels and speaks most in esoteric terms. In an esoteric sense, the I, that is the true self, that in you which says I, is one with the Father. That is to say, this is an extension of God. If that makes you nervous, theologically, you can say, well, it's not God, but it's a place in us where we connect with God. And it's that part of us where we most fundamentally say, I am. Why is that so often said to be a name of God? So that is certainly one dimension of that. Another little point I want to bring up is the symbolism there. In the Gospels, and I think particularly in John, stone always has to do with the literal level, the physical level. So in another sense, what this is saying is the Jews, who are portrayed as Christ's enemies in that Gospel, are throwing a literal meaning at him, and they're not really ready to make it stick. As you know, historically, who knows what's true, whether anyone really did try to stone him or not. Find a New Testament scholar and ask him to get lots of different answers. But no, you're basically, they're throwing this literal meaning at him, and that, in that sense, like the Jews, as used in that, like the scribes and the Pharisees, are esoterically people who live on the literal level of only understand the letter of the law. So you could say today that the scribes and Pharisees are the fundamentalists, people who take evangelicals, the people who really take all this stuff literally. So those are two things that you can get out of that. You could certainly get a lot more. I wrote an article about 30 years ago that fundamentalist critiques of the New Age. And one of them, the people who write these are all kind of nutty. But this one woman was harping on this, this New Age is teaching this idea, this ye are God's idea, that's the lie of the serpent in Genesis. Well, of course, that, as you've just seen, provably false, because that's what Jesus said. That's a verse in the Psalms that Jesus, it's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament, and it doesn't, in fact, that's not what the serpent says in Genesis. It says, you shall be as gods. So, this fundamentalist critic is like hammering at the New Age, can't even get her own Bible right. And that is more true of fundamentalist and evangelical critics of this kind of thing than they may be aware of themselves.
Well, that's a really interesting connection, because I was speaking with someone yesterday, and the person took out a Bible, and they pointed to exactly that. And they explained how that's exactly what happened, and how people were beguiled into thinking that they could be gods.
Which verse were they pointing to? The one in John?
No, exactly what you're talking about in Genesis, the idea of the serpent.
Well, if you want to talk about that esoterically for a minute, ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. It is, shall we say, a delusion that knowing good and evil makes you like God, in the sense that God, who is all loving, as everybody pretty agrees, does not know evil, because if God knew evil, as A Course in Miracles suggests, it would be real. If it were real, but it isn't real. It's our own imaginings. So it's our imagining we could be as God, but the truth is you are gods. And this good and evil thing is really simply a distraction, and a rather painful one.
That's a very interesting idea. But if God, to say that God doesn't know it, does he, in a sense, know of it, but recognizes it as illusory?
Well, if you want to use the language of A Course, the Father, who does not know of it in the strict sense, because if the Father knew it or knew of it, it would be true. It is kind of a confection of the mind of the fallen Son, which is all of us. And the aspect of the mind of God that recognizes both is called the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, shall we say, sees this level of good and evil, recognizing its ultimate illusions, and is able to kind of bridge the gap. Now, in bridging this gap, what is it called? It's called the atonement. It has nothing to do with Jesus dying on the cross for everybody's sins, which really, all of that only made sense, as I say in the book, in a day when, and this was true of the Jews as well as the pagans of Christ's time, religion basically was animal sacrifice. That was what it was. Everything else was kind of a side thing. As is attested in contemporary sources, the temple in Jerusalem had to have an elaborate plumbing system just to drain all the blood off. So, of course, they were bound to see this whole thing in the light of sacrifice. They couldn't see it any other way. But that doesn't mean it has anything to do with anything in reality. We know now, and even this was recognized even by the Hebrew prophets. What do you think? Do you think God really cares about the blood of lambs and bullocks? No. There was only so far they could take it because of the power of the priests. But even then, it was recognized and became increasingly clear as the centuries went on.
That was actually a very interesting passage. You mentioned that they were actually eating or selling meat, but that it was really the blood that what God wanted, or their idea of God wanted.
Sure. Where did I get that from? The book of Leviticus. That's why the Jews have to kosher their meat. They have to get every last drop of blood out. The blood is mine, saith the Lord. Their concept of religion in those days was that God wanted this life essence that was in the blood. And so they had to pour out all the blood. And that's why to this day there's kosher food. Does it make sense in a modern context? there are spirits. I mean, if you want to get a totally different realm, yeah, there are spirits that feed on blood, as that passage of the Odyssey I quoted in the book says. But God Himself, God Himself certainly doesn't need blood. I mean, everybody should laugh at that at this point. But it was in those days. It wasn't. I mean, religion in shall we say what astrologers call the Age of Aries was animal sacrifice, and so they were conceptually limited that way. We have our own conceptual limitations that will be seen by people 2,000 years from now that we don't even know, including me, including everybody.
Well, another interesting point you make in that section is connecting that to the persistence of our cultural obsession with vampires.
Yeah, there's that. That's a big subject. I was going to write an article about it, and I started and never did much with it. But here's my theory about vampires in mass culture today. The reason this theme is so pervasive is that we're surrounded with vampirism. In what form? Commercials. Everybody's already trying to suck your blood, your money. In a figurative sense, they want to suck your energy to make you fearful, so you'll buy their product or an ad. A great deal of advertising is geared precisely toward that. So subconsciously, the American public feels that it's surrounded by vampires all the time. And that, in my view, explains the fact that this theme has burgeoned, especially in the last 30 years. But that's perhaps not what you were getting at.
Well, it might be almost like a deep memory that is stimulated by the current socio-political situation.
Yeah, and there's the other thing, which is, there is such a thing as energy-sucking people. There are people, I've been around them myself, you just feel exhausted around them. They may be perfectly nice people. Like, you can barely stay awake in their presence, and then the minute they go, you feel fired. And is this conscious? In most cases, probably not. But people don't really understand because of this the scientistic bigotry that I was talking about earlier, that this sort of thing happens. It's not supposed to happen. We can't measure it on our machines, and we have no kind of theory that would could get us tenure at a university that would explain it. So therefore, it doesn't exist, but it does, and that all this stuff. People are aware of this stuff, and that is why there's so much fascination with the occult in mass culture. And the fact that the scientific, intellectual world, the world, the New York Times and, the American intelligentsia can't even face this, makes it surface all the more powerfully in the mass imagination.
Well, that makes sense.
It was kind of an interesting synchronicity because I was formulating this question in my mind before I had read A Theology of Love. And then within about the first 50 pages or so, you touched on exactly like where I was going with the question. So I thought that was a kind of cool sign that I should ask this to you. Since it is kind of a little bit long, feel free to stop me at any point if you'd like to respond. So the first idea is, are you familiar with the works of Ken Wilber?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. One thing in his book, The Spectrum of Consciousness, I found really interesting in terms of Jung. Wilber discussed different levels of the mind or consciousness in terms of bands. So moving past ego, past the biosocial bands, past the shadow, you get to the transpersonal bands, and those are where the collective unconscious lives. Jung stated, to quote him, mystical experience is experience of archetypes. Rather than speaking about God, Jung often spoke of the God archetype or the Godhead.
Well, that was as far as he could see, and that was as far as he felt qualified to speak upon, because he's trying to root himself in psychology as a discipline as it was at the time. But I would not say that that's necessarily the case. I would say that that kind of thing may be experienced as a God, but I strongly believe there are levels you can go well beyond that.
Right. That's exactly where I was going. when Wilber discusses that you can go beyond mystical experience, that is simply experience of the archetypes, he differentiates the two experiences by stating that while the archetypes are experienced as forms, the unification in true mystical experience is formless.
Well, that is kind of classic Buddhist theory, because in Buddhist theory or many Buddhist systems, there are three kind of levels. One is the desire level, which is kind of the level at which everyone is kind of pushed around by their desires and so on. Then there's the level of form, which I think he's equating with the experience of the archetypes, and then the formless level.
Right.
Whether this, again, I believe it is important not to try to smash all of the systems into one kind of lump. Obviously, there are parallels. Whether if he's talking about, or he thinks Jung is talking about what the Buddhists were talking about, well, that's it. And it's anyone's guess. Anyway, you told me I could interrupt you.
So what that brought me to is Einstein said that if he believed in a God, it was the God of Spinoza, a God who is found in the seemingly creative and intelligent structures of the universe. So it is a formless and entirely impersonal God. And I have certainly felt the divine in that way, but I've also felt it in an entirely incompatible way with that, which is feeling the divine as love.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So in A Theology of Love, you mentioned Meister Eckhart's idea that the personal God is, to quote, a manifestation of the impersonal ground of being. So we have this connection, right, where a God appears as both entirely impersonal and formless, and on the other hand, in the sense of love, which also might intimate something about embodiment or form. But in any case, just to keep it simply as appearing impersonal and personal, and with your idea that the personal God is a manifestation of the impersonal ground of being, I would like to get your idea on particularly where, if that word can be used, such manifestation is occurring.
Not sure I understand the question.
Okay, I'll try to reformulate it.
Well, I'll give you a short answer, which may cover a lot of what you're asking about.
Okay.
If we accept that God is infinite and beyond our conception, then there's really no reason we cannot experience and relate to God in both an impersonal and personal form. Now, you can even take this further, because Xenophanes said that if horses had gods, they would make them look like horses. And in a way, this was obviously meant probably somewhat derisively, but as human beings, we're going to conceive of God anthropomorphically. That's just the way it is, because that's the way our minds are structured. The usual conclusion from this is that it's all a bunch of rubbish. But maybe we could see it in another way. Maybe we could see it as, yes, our anthropomorphizing God is necessarily limited, necessarily restricted. But at the same time, we're human beings, and we might as well be authentic to our experience as human beings and experience it in that way. There are forces, whatever, that are impersonal. They experience God in a personal way? No. But we're persons, and we do. So we may as well not only kind of accept that fact, but embrace it with some kind of authenticity.
I see. This is perhaps too loaded of a question to answer, but one explanation could be, for example, that God is perfectly impersonal and formless, but that the God archetype is of form and of love and all of that sort of thing. So then my answer to the question would be that the manifestation of the impersonal ground of being is in the transcendental bands of the mind. I don't prescribe to that, but Well, what would your opinion on that be?
Well, another way of looking at it entirely is Jung's concept of the archetypes were, you may have even defined them more or less this way, as structuring principles of consciousness. So if these are, and he said the numbers were archetypes, by the way. So the archetypes, both, kind of personal archetypes, personalized archetypes like, the trickster and whatever, or, and number archetypes may be part of this conceptual box that we have built for ourselves. And that the truth lies wholly beyond all of this. I don't know what Jung would have said to that. His answers, well, his answers often seem sort of wordy and a bit unclear, but he was probably aware of the dichotomy.
There's that adage that the opposite of love is not hate, but fear. And the wisdom of that seems to show in the subtitle to your book, A Spirituality Based on Love, Not Fear.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, notice, by the way, as a kind of a prelude to all of this, how easy it is to kind of slip into fear. But actually, it's really not saying anything more than what if, because we're governed by an elite now, as I think you know. We were governed by an elite 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Generally, there's always a government of an elite. And the question is, are these going to be people who are deluded by greed and fear and evil, as one might conclude is the case today? Or is it going to be an elite of genuinely good, decent people? And that's kind of what it amounts to. As for myself, that is kind of what Moraviev says. I don't really know. I don't have any outlook on the future. That is what Moraviev said. And you can ask, well, has the human race progressed any in the 50 years since he wrote that? Well, I don't know. In some ways it looks as if we have, in some ways it looks as if we've gone back. I'm not particularly advocating, any kind of political measures on these lines. And it's generally speaking that, and that's kind of the problem. And who was the first person who saw this problem? Plato. You want to be ruled by wise, good people, but wise, good people aren't going to want to be bothered with this. The only people who are going to want to be bothered with this are people who are desperate for power in one way or another. And we've actually been luckier in our leadership than most nations have been. Not, I would say, at the moment, but and that's kind of the problem. Why would a philosopher want to govern? But probably, in Plato's sense, why would a philosopher want to govern? And yet, for that very reason, he would be the best person to govern. I don't think it's saying any more than that.
But since you've brought up the issue of fear, I have to admit there's a passage that I know is going to elicit fear. And you have this statement about the new man, and you talk about Moraviev. He was talking about the true self, the real I, the new man. I'll just read this excerpt right here. The first is what he calls the personality, and which we can identify with the street-level self. The second, the real I, is the true self, the new man, and the man with the second birth, that of individuality, has shifted his center of gravity from the personality, where it is for the exterior man, to the real I, that is the self. One who has undergone the second birth has access to the self, the true I, the Christ within, continually, if not continuously. He adds that unless humanity is governed by an elite consisting of such new men, the deluge of fire is a likely outcome. The idea of a different interpretation of standard Christian theology that involves humanity being governed by an elite is totally in line with what a lot of fundamentalists, and I include even a lot of people who follow Alex Jones, call the New World Order.
Yeah, but who cares what these fundamentalists think? Like, if I believe the news, which is probably not a terribly good idea, they're all in favor of the worst and most criminal elements in our government. So I don't really care what they think. Their opinions, I think, should be taken far less seriously, listened to, and broadcast far less than they have been, much less be mistaken for anything that actually called itself Christianity.
No, I absolutely agree. It's just maybe I tend to follow these things closely because I find them interesting just in terms of maybe the sociology of religion, but I see this very strong preoccupation with any kind of what would be perceived as adulteration of scripture or theology as people feel to be in line with a fundamentalist reading of the Bible as being part of essentially a satanic plot that's manifesting through globalism. And so the idea of an interpretation of Christianity that's coming via channeling right there's going to be a lot of that type of response.
Anyone who holds to certain of these political things, and I'm not getting specific here, they're simply not a Christian. So I don't really care what the fundamentalists think. If I were of a certain paranoid frame of mind, I would say that, as Christ would have said to them if you were around, ye of your father the devil, metaphorically speaking.
I noticed a connection when you describe forgiveness to destroy versus forgiveness for salvation. I immediately saw a connection to what Chogyam Trungpa called idiot compassion, an idea that he got from Gurdjieff. Do you see something to that connection there?
No, I think they're a little bit different. Forgiveness to destroy can best be illustrated by the fact that if someone says, I forgive you, you may be just as likely to be offended as reassured by that. Because in many cases, it's used as kind of this lordly disdain. Well, I forgive you. You sound like a priest. That, I think, of course, is talking about in terms of forgiveness to destroy. The other thing is idiot compassion. I don't remember that phrase from Trungpa, but Gurdjieff said that one of the symptoms of the defective mentality of modern man is what he called the tendency vainly to grow sincerely indignant. And I think anyone who spends much time on Facebook, including myself, would do well to remember that phrase fairly often.
Right. Okay, and then the second part, you quote from Thomas Mann on the sort of travesty of only having one word, love, which describes all sorts of things, including even hate. And you divide love into unconscious and conscious love, and of special relationships and holy relationships. To briefly quote from your book on that, with regard to A Course in Miracles, put simply, the Course's goal is to transmute special relationships into holy relationships. It insists upon transmuting them rather than ending them, which would just lead to seeking out another special relationship, starting the process all over again. How would you describe these types of love and relationship, and how would you relate them to one another in the sense of that transmutation?
Well, I have two sons. I could look at them as many parents do, as my property, for whom I have certain agendas and ambitions, often to satisfy ambitions and agendas that I never managed to fulfill myself. I could insist that they have to be X, Y, and Z way because they're my child. How could my child do something? I will not let my child do that sort of thing. That is a special relationship as manifested in parenthood. It is so insanely common that it will be more difficult to avoid seeing examples than to look for examples.
Right.
The holy relationship in terms of children is like, well, I don't own my children.
Right.
I don't have a responsibility to make their lives into some little product that, however well-meaning, they have nothing to do with the way they are. They're in my care for a certain amount of time. I have to impart certain values as I understand them, but they're not ultimately my property. I care for them as individuals, and they don't have to do anything or turn into anything to satisfy me. So that is kind of a hands-on, nuts and bolts description of the difference.
Okay, that's the difference between unconscious love and conscious love, as well as the special and holy relationships?
Yeah, well, the special, yes, to a certain degree. Because you're unconscious. The first type of love is unconscious because you genuinely think you love your child. And you generally do in kind of a way, but not in a way that generally fosters their being or their well-being. In a way that's just kind of unconsciously fosters your agenda. Whereas if you're consciously aware of them as beings with their own essential integrity, you would be a little more cautious, I think, about deciding how far they were going to go with soccer, or whether they were going to get to Harvard or not.
Okay, well, I can say that reading the book has it's been a very interesting experience for me, and I read the entire book. I made a lot of charts, and I agree with what you say. Like sometimes you can get carried away in terms of mapping one system to another because it's that can be facile at sometimes. But it is intriguing that there seems to be kind of recurring structures.
Yeah, and it's a useful exercise and an interesting one and a valuable one. As long as get too dogmatic about it.
I think you basically have to think about how the connections or correspondences are affecting your life, if at all. There are so many people out there with these just tremendously built, crystalline castle structures, but basically their entire life is just tending to
that. This is true. Well, I think one thing is that if you can create a mapping from one system to another, and it seems that there's a system that you've studied and you find it very intriguing, but it just doesn't seem, you don't seem to be able to make it work. It's not working for you. And there's another system where it kind of accentuates things differently, and there's a practice connected with that where you think, I think maybe I could actually do that. Like that sounds like something that might work better for me than there might be an insight there that would allow for the type of practical application that you're talking about.
Thank you, Richard Smoley.
Yeah, it was very stimulating. And you might like this. You sparked me to read William Blake, and I was sitting there in a coffee house, and I was really looking at the people around me. I had a deeper sense of that each of those people is actually living a life that is as big to them as my life is to me. Like I felt like it shifted my perception.
I just wanted to say that I also enjoyed the book, and I took a lot of notes, and I'm going to be going back to it and learning more from it in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And my website is innerchristianity.com, and my books and videos are available on the usual sites. So you can binge watch me on YouTube and so on. So as long as you have my name, you know how to find me. So, well, it's been a pleasure. You've obviously read my book very thoroughly and intelligently, and I really do appreciate that.
So, do you want to just try to wing the outro and see what happens?
Yeah, I think winging the outro is a good idea.
We could say, if we were going to record an outro, then maybe we should say this and that.
Yeah, like, you've been listening to Phenomenoumena with co-hosts Ray, I am he.
And Gino. Yeah, well, we could do it like that.
Yeah, and then we could direct them to all the places where the podcast would be found. Spotify, iTunes, wherever they are. And, check out our webpage, Phenomenoumena.com. What about using this? Can we use this?
yeah, I think maybe we should use this.